This Late Night Linux Family podcast is made possible by our patrons. Go to latenightlinux.com/support for details of how you can join them. Support us on Patreon for access to ad-free episodes and early releases. That's latenightlinux.com/support. 2.5 Admins, episode 257. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. There were a couple of outages recently. One 19-hour Outlook outage and one Cloudflare 1.1.1.1 incident. And these outages kind of expose a bit of a fragility that we have these days because of all the centralization.
But see, if you just put all your eggs in this one basket, we'll have the best basket holder in the world walking around with it, and nothing will ever go wrong, we promise.
Yeah, the problem with hyperscalers is there's only a couple of them, and we've seen the same thing where there was outage at Google Cloud, so these 25 services you depend on didn't work that day. Or in this case, Microsoft 365 has kind of had recurring issues over time.
Yeah, the register likes to call it 362 and stuff like that. They keep a count, I think.
That's assuming you can even get the apps to install in the first place. I got to tell you, I am dead sick of having to go through and do registry edits and clear the TPM and do all kinds of nonsense just to get Office 365 to install on brand new, clean Windows 11 Pro installations. I'm having to do this on at least 9 out of 10, and sometimes existing machines just stop working. And until you go through and you manually do some registry edits and potentially clear values out of the TPM, you can't log into your email. This is, of course, completely separate from the cloud outage that we're talking about right now.
Yeah, in particular, the analyst they talked to in the article says the most common technical culprit is the failure of Azure Active Directory, which is now called Entra ID, to try to stop giving Active Directory a bad name, I think. That handles authentication and so on. And when that doesn't work, nobody can log into anything. And anybody who's done enough IT in their life to know that Active Directory is quite the ball of sticky tape and gum and toothpicks and so on to try to keep it all working, making, the entire world's IT things depend on one really big version of that instead of everybody having their own domain controller. You really see how it can cause these widespread outages, and that happens more frequently than we would all like.
It probably seemed really cool to name Kerberos after, the three-headed dog that guards the gates of hell when they were first coming up with those protocols. But these days, when it feels like you're dealing with the three-headed dog at the gates of hell, it maybe seems like less of a good naming idea.
Yeah, but to Tim's point about putting all your eggs in one basket, there were all these promises about how, they'd have better IT people, they would do more security and all this stuff. And so far, all we've seen as the same problems that happen at any IT department, except for more concentrated because there are more things to go wrong. When there is an incident, it's bigger and impacts more people, whether it is an outage or a compromise or whatever. It's just that much bigger of a blast radius rather than actually seeming to happen any less frequently.
I think it's probably fair also to say that, to some degree, this is a scale problem. We talk a lot about, the issues that people don't understand with RAID and thinking that, if I throw 100 drives at a problem, I'm 100 times more likely to keep my data, when in fact, you have 100 times as many individual points of failure that can bring the whole thing down. If you're going to run a service as massive as Office 365 that has to service literally a significant fraction of the entire planet's users, you need an awful lot of administrators to run this thing. And every human that you add to the mix is also a potential point of failure. It's somebody else who can make mistakes. It's somebody else who can not think things all the way through. It's that much more bean counting up the top to think, what head count can we get rid of that we don't need anymore to make, the business leaner and more efficient? And the folks who have to pay that price always wind up being the end users. So basically, millions of people all over the world were unable to access their email for 19 hours straight. And one of the things that really frustrates me about this is Microsoft could do a much better job with transparency about what caused the incident, what they've done to resolve it. It's surprisingly difficult to find that information. Microsoft actually directed people to their account on X, the social media platform that was formerly Twitter. And when you look at their post on X, there's no real information there. They just say, we've determined the cause of the issue and have deployed a fix. We're closely monitoring its deployment and expect the issue to gradually resolve. You can find more details within our Service Health portal, but the Service Health portal only tells you the current status. It doesn't tell you anything about that incident. And when I Google the incident by the tracking number that Microsoft assigned to it, I don't get much better results. I don't get anything from Microsoft.com. The only thing from within Microsoft's domain that Coggy or Google picks up for me is somebody on answers.microsoft.com asking, hey, why doesn't my email work? There's nothing official there. We're just left to guess.
So on the status.cloud.microsoft website that you were talking about that has no history, there's a little button that says check status in admin center, which you can only do if you have a Microsoft 365 account. And via going into there and going to the issue history tab and digging around a little bit, I found the specific incident you were talking about by that issue ID. And they have a modicum of information about what actually happened and the full timeline of their fix taking forever to get out. But it turns out that 2 certificates that are part of the configuration were expected to not be used anymore, and so were decommissioned. Their standard procedure includes deleting those certificates in stages via their, quote, safe deployment practices. However, a, quote, system regression inadvertently caused the deletion of these certificates to occur in all environments simultaneously, resulting in nobody being able to log in.
Remember what I said about all those individual points of failure?
Yeah. Turns out everybody depends on these 2 certificates Microsoft thought nobody was using.
And Microsoft, I just got to say, asking us to go look at a thread on X, unacceptable. You really need to do better publishing the tales about this kind of thing. None of my clients would be okay with me just saying, oh, well, something was wrong, but, then I fixed it. Go look at my social media if you want to know more. And there's nothing there either. If I caused a 19-hour outage at a single small business, you had most of the world down for 19 hours straight. We deserve some real information, and we shouldn't have to go on X to get it.
Well, even in this Microsoft admin console, I get a little panel that slides out that's maybe a third of my screen that contains it, while the rest of the screen is just a list of issues and so on. I don't get even a full screen view of this. All I have is a little button to get notified of changes to the issue for while it was still happening.
Contrast that with Cloudflare's incident report. And we do like to shit on Cloudflare quite a lot, but in fairness to them, this was very detailed.
They do publish good after action things when things do go wrong. They maybe just go wrong more than they should, but at least they do give you the full view of what happened. So their public resolver 1.1.1.1 had an outage for just over an hour, and they go into the details of what happened. But to summarize what actually happened is they have 2 different systems for what they call data localization suite, which is about customers being able to pick which data centers their content will get served from, so that if for compliance reasons you're not allowed to have your data be cached in China, you can make sure that Cloudflare will route your traffic not to their data center in China and so on. Or you only want to pay for certain data centers or whatever options you have.
Or maybe not in America.
Exactly. Literally for GDPR stuff, it could be that we only want this data to be in the EU.
Yeah.
And so for their service topology system, they have 2 different mechanisms. They have the older legacy one, which involved them basically have a config file of which blocks of IPs are attached to which data centers, and then a new fancy automated thing that's supposed to deal with the fact that it turns out very frequently that manually curated list of IP addresses ends up forgetting to add an IP address to a new data center or forgetting to move something. And, human error means that they've been bitten a number of times by config changes.
There's those points of failure again.
Yeah. But it turns out 1.1.1.1 is still on the legacy system because it goes to every data center and didn't really need the new fancy thing. And the new fancy thing wasn't actually going live just yet. So it turns out they actually planted the seeds for this incident back in June. On June 6th, they introduced this bug where they're accidentally going to say, hey, 1.1.1.1 is only served out of this new data center that doesn't actually exist yet. It's just for testing. It's like a simulated data center. But because it didn't result in a change of network configuration, none of the routes for 1.1.1 were affected and everything continued to work. Then, 6 weeks later, on July 14th, a configuration change was made to that same DLS service. The change attached a test location to the non-production service. This location itself was not live, but the change triggered a refresh in all of their network configuration globally due to that configuration error earlier where they had 1.1.1.1 in the list for that new data center. It meant that 1.1.1.1 was only advertised from the new data center that wasn't actually there, and so it wasn't advertised by any of their routers, and now nobody could get to 1.1.1.1 at all.
I think it's worth pointing out here the difference in the length of the outage for these two incidents as well. Microsoft had Outlook down for 19 hours straight. Cloudflare got it all back in one sock in 62 minutes when 1.1.1.1 went down. And the complexity of the errors was very different as well. Essentially, Microsoft just accidentally the whole certificate on a couple of certificates, whereas Cloudflare's outage was considerably more complicated and, involved bad BGP routes that had to get, revoked and reissued. There's a whole lot more complexity there, and yet they got everything back up and running, diagnosed, fixed, resolved massively more quickly. And this is just speculation, but I have to believe the difference in company culture between, well, whatever, we got it up and running, nobody needs to hear much about it, I don't know, post something on X and call it a day, versus like when we screw up, we're going to have to do a post-mortem for the whole world with all of the details. I feel like there's a follow-on effect in the company culture, and that's why Cloudflare was able to resolve what looks like a much more complex issue in 1/19th the time that Microsoft took to figure out that they accidentally the whole certificate.
Yeah. So they made that error at 21:48. About 5 minutes later, they noticed, hey, we're not seeing any traffic to our resolvers anymore. That's a big drop. What's going on there? About 2 minutes later, they noticed a second thing, which we'll talk about in a second, an actual a BGP origin hijack. Now that they weren't announcing 1.1.1.0/24, somebody else was. What? We'll come back to that one. So then at 22:01, so about 13 minutes after it happened, they detected, hey, something is really, really wrong here. We need to fix it. And they declared an incident immediately. And then they had a fix rolled out less than 20 minutes after that. And it just, because of BGP propagation delay and so on, it took the rest of another half hour and a bit to actually have all the traffic come back to normal. And they also had some notes about how their DOT or DNS over TLS and DOH, DNS over HTTP, were less impacted because they tend to use the host name based things, which aren't anycasted to 1.1.1.1. They use some of the other IPs they have. Because, you're typing in a host name like cloudflare-dns.com when you configure it, not having to type in a number, so they didn't go with a easy to memorize number or whatever. But that's very interesting. And I think a lot to Jim's point that the culture around we're going to have to explain what we did means that they are looking at this a lot more closely.
I think it's pretty similar to, there was a big change in the way that I wrote code. When I first started writing publicly available open source code, it was a real game changer for me because I had to take everything seriously. It wasn't enough that it worked. It had to be done right because I knew smarter people than I was would be looking at the code and, making fun of me in front of the entire world if I did something really boneheaded. So it really changed my processes and procedures and the way I thought about writing code, the way I did write code. And my projects were far better for it. I've written proprietary code and I've written open source code, and I promise I did a way better job on the open source stuff. And while we're not really talking about open source software versus proprietary software here exactly, we are definitely talking about a more open methodology versus an everything behind closed doors and it works, don't bother us. And you can't mistake the difference. You really can't.
So about the BGP hijack, that was an interesting one. It says in the report here, once our configuration error had been exposed and Cloudflare systems had withdrawn all the routes for 1.1.1.1, that should have meant that there were no routes to it at all on the entire internet. However, that wasn't actually what happened. We got reports via Cloudflare Radar that Tata Communications India had started advertising 1.1.1.0/24. From the perspective of the routing system, that looked exactly like a BGP hijack. This was unexpected to see while they were troubleshooting this routing issue, but to be perfectly clear, this BGP hijack was not the cause of the outage, and they're following up with Tata. I'm guessing they have a local rule on Tata's side that's supposed to route the traffic to 1.1.1.1 slightly differently, and when the preferred route to actual Cloudflare went away, they started pushing their route up in the wrong direction. pushing it back upstream when they didn't mean to.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to 2.5admins.com/support for details of how you can support us too. Patreon supporters have the option to listen to episodes without ads like this. And it's not just this show. There's Late Night Linux for news, discoveries, audience input, and misanthropy. Linux Matters for upbeat family-friendly adventures. Linux After Dark for silly challenges and philosophical debates. Linux Dev Time about developing with and for Linux. Hybrid Cloud Show for everything public and private cloud. And Ask the Hosts for off-topic questions from you. You can even get some episodes a bit early. We've got a lot going on, and it's only possible because of the people who support us. So if you like what we do and can afford it, it would be great if you could support us too at 2.5admins.com/support. Let's Encrypt have issued their first IP address certificate, and this is going to be generally available relatively soon.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. There are a bunch of cases where you want to have HTTPS and you don't have a specific domain name. One of the cases they mentioned actually is certain like web servers that are hosting a lot of different websites when they have to have a default certificate that's going to come up when the website's not recognized or there is no website when you go to just the IP address. Being able to have that be the IP address of the server instead of getting there, hey, this website's trying to pretend this to be this other website or whatever, could make a lot of sense. It's a little more interesting in that, unlike domain names, you don't necessarily have the same assurances about who controls an IP address. Like we were just talking about with the Cloudflare outage, there's also BGP hijacks where a whole range of IP addresses can suddenly be controlled by a different group of people than the first people. As we saw with Tata taking over 1.1.1.1 temporarily while Cloudflare was outaged. And so with the way Let's Encrypt works, they might actually be able to, during a hijack like that, issue a certificate to the person doing the hijack for that IP address. But Let's Encrypt specifically is only doing their new short-lived profile certificates. So the certificates have to be renewed every couple of days so that if you lose control, they will revoke the old certificate or it'll expire automatically.
Yeah, a maximum of 6 days, which makes sense specifically for IP addresses, which are much more likely to change hands more frequently than domain names, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and if the IP address does change hands, you don't necessarily know that it changed hands legitimately. It could have changed hands because that subnet got sold, or it could have changed hands because somebody published a route somewhere on the other side of the world, and now it's somewhere in Russia or China or India or what have you, in the hands of some ne'er-do-wells. And I think that brings up another point about the IP certificates. Specifically with the way Let's Encrypt handles authentication. You're generally doing, DNS based, or just like literally I have a web server that can answer here. Therefore it says, okay, yep, you own that. So we'll issue a certificate. And that means that when you're looking at IP address certs, it's maybe not really all that wise to think of it as a form of authentication, which is half of what HTTPS certificates really are. It's not just encrypting the traffic, it's also proving you are who you say you are. And if you're looking at a Let's Encrypt cert for an IP address, I'm not sure it's valid to say that it really authenticates that you are who you say you are. However, it's still definitely useful because without the authentication part, at least no man in the middle is able to read the traffic or modify the traffic that you're sending back and forth. And this could be very useful, in terms of like communicating with routers or DNS servers that, you can't actually communicate with by domain name. You need to go by raw IP address. So does this really work for authentication? I would argue that it doesn't, but it does encrypt the traffic, and that's worth doing.
Yeah. And as I mentioned in the article there, not surprisingly, you can't use DNS challenge method to prove you control the IP address because that's not how that works. But you can do the .well-known thing over HTTP or the ALPN mechanism, which is the one where you do a special TLS-based handshake that I think currently only the Caddy web server and the Let's Encrypt, is it certbot maybe, actually do, and like Nginx and Apache don't support it yet.
I think I might argue that they actually should be supporting DNS-based auth for this because the DNS, again, is at least a little bit easier to prove that you're the legitimate owner of. Because like if, in theory, you could say, okay, you need to prove that you actually own this subnet before we'll issue a certificate for these IP addresses. But if they did that, you wouldn't be able to actually get a certificate for IP addresses if you were, using hosting it like a, Linode or DigitalOcean or what have you, because it's not your IP address. It's theirs. So if you're supposed to be able to get like one-off certificates for an IP address that you have the use of, but you don't actually technically own, well, like I said, that means that the whole concept of authentication is pretty much dead in the water. And it's actually even more dead in the water the shorter the certificate lifespan is, because that just means it takes that much less time before an attacker who can take over that IP address, for example, by way of a BGP route hijack, is able to get Let's Encrypt to say, oh, yeah, totally legit. They're the guys. Well, you already knew they had control of that IP address because you were able to connect to it. So Let's Encrypt isn't telling you anything you don't already know.
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. And if you want to send in your questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Ray writes, I'm planning to set up a new small form factor server for use as a ZFS replication target. Currently, both my primary and backup servers run Ubuntu 22.04, but as I plan out the new build, I wonder if it makes sense to run a completely different OS on the backup target, like TrueNAS, for example. This way, if there was ever a show-stopping bug in either OS, it would only affect one machine. What do you all think? As a follow-up, what are other intentional differences, if any, between your primary servers and backups?
So running different versions would be fine. In fact, even encouraged, as you're saying, there's some advantages to having diversity there. And you may even have some diversity in the version of ZFS that you use, because ZFS replication is fully backwards and forwards compatible. So you can send from a 10-year-old older version of ZFS to a newer version and vice versa. And so depending on the flags you set, you can go as far forward and backward as you want. And doing that can be helpful. As far as intentional differences, there's not very many on my backup systems. They have far fewer users and a lot less software than the primaries. They're much more locked down. And I set the datasets to be read-only on the backup, but that's mostly just to avoid the timestamp of the last time it was mounted and so on getting changed and causing the replication script to have to roll back to the snapshot before it can do the next incremental. But I don't know that I have very much else that's actually intentionally different between the primary and the backup. It depends also if you're setting up to be just a backup that you would restore from, or as Jim's talked about many times, actually having like a full duplicate server that's exactly the same, and I'm going to be able to flip IP addresses over to it and have it pretend to be the original, basically, and therefore I would want no differences wherever possible.
Yeah, I usually have one of each. Like Alan said, my standard topology is I have a production machine. The production machine hosts VMs. All the actual workload is done inside the VMs. There's no actual work being done on the host itself. I have a hot spare on site on the same broadcast network segment, and it receives replication typically hourly from production. So if the production system just completely catches on fire and cannot be rescued, that means I can shut it down, I can go over to the backup machine, and I can simply import all the XML definitions for the VM files, and if the ZFS path is the same, I don't need to do anything else. I can just immediately verse start all my VMs. They pick up their original IP addresses, are available on the network exactly where they were. Nothing else needs to be reconfigured anywhere other than, and this part is important, obviously, I use Sanoid and Syncoid. And the other thing, if you're doing a hot spare, make sure when you activate your hot spare, you need to tell it to stop trying to go pull new replication in to overwrite these data sets that you're now using in prod and running VMs out of. And you also will want to temporarily change your template in Sanoid.conf from hot spare, which does not take snapshots, it only prunes them, to production, which will automatically take new snapshots for you. That's all you need to do, and you have now promoted your hot spare box to production. Everything is running, all the users are happy. And yes, you generally want that to be as close as possible to the specs and the everything else of the original production box. With that said, a lot of smaller clients will basically do a deal where, like, when they upgrade their production box, the old production box, which is still running and doing pretty well, just kind of gets demoted to be the hot spare. And, you kind of lather, rinse, repeat on that. So you're sort of splitting the difference. The ideal is to have identical machines production and a hot spare, so you have absolutely no perceptible difference when you migrate your stuff over and run it live on the hot spare. But you kind of split the difference if, like, last generation's production box is your current hot spare, because you still have enough headroom for everything to work. You may have slightly reduced performance, but also you're kind of cutting down on how much hardware you have to buy, and sometimes that can make life a little easier. Then on top of that, the next step is the disaster recovery box. Now, where the hot spare box is as close to identical as possible and needs to be right there in the same location on the same network segment, disaster recovery is physically separated. You got to go across the internet and, some form of VPN tunnel. In my case, it's pretty much always going to be WireGuard, to get to it. And it will only take replication once daily. And it's not typically going to be designed necessarily to run the VMs. Now, some clients will still want the DR box to be capable of functioning that way, so that if the entire production facility gets destroyed somehow, taking both servers with it, you can drag the DR box out to a construction trailer, get a bunch of laptops from Walmart, and be ready to go. But you don't have to do it that way. It can be nothing but a replication target, in which case it is probably going to be built very different from production to hot spare. It's going to have a lot less CPU firepower. It's going to have a lot less RAM, and it's probably going to be running, depending on the scale, it may be running banks of, like 6-wide RAID Z2 VDEVs rather than be running mirrors for highest performance the way that, the production and hot spare are.
Yeah, because that lets you keep a longer tail of snapshots.
Now, one of the important things in this setup is you might have noticed that I talked about having hourly replication on-site and daily replication off-site. Now, when I first started doing this, that was essentially a necessity because, truly broadband internet connections, both upstream and downstream, were effectively unobtainium, where I mostly do business in the American Southeast. These days, for most businesses, that's really not the case, and decent amounts of bandwidth are pretty accessible, and it may very well be pretty easy to do hourly offsite. However, I usually don't recommend that, and the reason for that is if you have somebody do something just incredibly weapons-grade stupid on the source, like roll all of your data sets back way, way, way back, that is something that can get replicated off to your hot spare and your disaster recovery. And if that's happening on the hour every hour, it's possible that something really nasty might wipe out everything before you get a chance to catch it. Now, on the other hand, if you're going to hot spare hourly, but you're only going to DR daily, that greatly increases your chance that one of these really, like once or twice in a career level weapons grade screw ups will take out your hot spare, but it won't have had a chance to get out to the DR box yet. Now, back to Ray's other question about whether it makes sense to run a completely different operating system. That could absolutely be, an interesting thing to do. It'll give you a little bit of separation. It might insulate you from some kind of show-stopping bug. It might also expose you to an unexpected bug where you have, different upgrades at different times in your different OS versions. I will say, if you're thinking of a separate operating system, I probably wouldn't recommend TrueNAS for this. That's because you're starting out with Ubuntu 22.04, which strongly implies to me that you're used to doing everything on the command line, set up your own cron jobs and or systemd timers, whatever. And if that's the headspace you're in, I would really recommend just vanilla FreeBSD instead of TrueNAS. Because what you'll find with TrueNAS is it's harder to do things on the command line the way you want to do them on a TrueNAS box, because TrueNAS very, very much expects you're only using TrueNAS's tooling in TrueNAS's graphical user interface the way they expected you to do it. So if you know how to do things your own way and you want to do things your own way, you'll probably be happier with plain FreeBSD.
Yeah, TrueNAS is an appliance, so it wants to be in control of everything. And if you're happy to do it yourself, you'll be much happier with a system that gets out of your way unless you do it your way.
Right, well, we'd better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or your feedback. You can find me at joelrest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.